The emu is a close relative of the cassowary, but because it has been able to adapt to the plains, it has spread over a much larger area of Australia. When the breeding season arrives, the males do almost all the work. In a protected spot from which the surrounding area can be observed, the male prepares a simple nest. The female merely lays the eggs and then leaves incubation up to her mate. During this time, approximately 2 months, the male does not eat, drink, or even defecate, while the female only helps him for the first 2 weeks, chasing away intruders. To be able to survive this harsh test, the male accumulates fat before courtship and enters a state of semi-lethargy during the incubation. But it's all worth it if, after 8 weeks, the chicks are hatched safe and sound. The emus are great lovers of water, on which they depend to a great extent in the heat of the Australian plains. Even the chicks are able to swim just a week after emerging from the egg, and once they have hatched, Father Emu goes off to slake his thirst, with all his offspring trotting along behind. The open plains were a new testing ground for the animals of Australia. To survive here, it was necessary not only to be able to withstand seasonal droughts and feed on grasses, but also to be able to flee from enemies at great speed. With their powerful legs, the emus can run at 50 kilometers an hour. But how did the marsupials manage? Away from the protective cover of the forest, there were no trees to seek refuge in, and the main food source was pasture. And nonetheless, the plains were to be the place where the most emblematic animals of the entire continent would evolve, the kangaroos. Wallabies, pademelons, wallaroos and kangaroos themselves developed a dentition and a digestive system which enabled them to feed on the tough grasses. Out on the plains, they were more exposed, especially in the breeding season, but the very fact they are marsupials proved to be a great advantage. When they had to take flight, they simply put their young in the pouch and fled at great speed. The marsupial's pouch replaced the protective jungles for these young and inexpert kangaroos. There they had shelter, protection. But the adaptations of the kangaroos did not stop there. The development of a powerful tail provided stability, which meant they were able to stand up on 2 legs and remain erect above the grasses, scanning the vast horizon. The tail was also the final touch in the most important adaptive weapon of all, powerful legs which enabled it to flee at great speed, and what's more, to do so by jumping, and so avoiding the obstacles of the landscape. A quoll, a carnivorous marsupial which the colonists named the native cat, in order to distinguish it from the domestic cats they brought with them in their ships. Like the real cats, the quolls are expert hunters, and the Australian night is full of potential prey. Insects are an important part of the diet of this small, silent, nocturnal hunter, so the formation of open land was to their advantage. The flowers attracted insects, and hunting became easier. But approximately 15 million years ago, when the continent of Australia came close enough to the islands of what is now Indonesia, some rodents managed to reach the coast and immediately became highly valued prey for the native hunters. In the ancestral competition among the different groups of mammals, this was a victory for the Marsupials. 20 million years of isolation meant they were the best equipped to dominate their territories, and these small Eutherian mammals, far from posing a threat, became an important part of their diet. In the distant days of the fragmentation of Gondwana, Australia was inhabited by large marsupials. Some of them were herbivores, some the size of present-day hippopotamuses, and others vicious hunters, similar to today's lions and tigers. But the fight between hunters and prey in present-day Australia is on a somewhat more modest scale. On the soft ground covered in leaves, a bandicoot is looking for worms and insects hidden in the shadows. The same leaves that hide tasty mouthfuls also serve to cover its tunnels in which it takes refuge when danger appears. Because though they may look cute, some of the nocturnal marsupials are in fact fierce hunters. The brush-tailed phascogale is not the cheeky squirrel it appears to be. The first colonists in Sydney baptized it the vampire marsupial and spoke of it as a bloodthirsty killer. And perhaps it is for the cockroaches, beetles and spiders which make up the main part of its diet. Because the evident exaggeration of the colonists is due more to the character of the phascogale than to the raids which from time to time it makes on the hen houses where it kills and devours the birds. The unions of marsupials and rodents made new adaptations necessary. Both groups competed for the same resources, and in this battle new and original means of survival appeared. The stick-nest rat is one of these survivors. It is a small rodent barely 20 centimeters long which feeds on leaves and fruits and is much sought after by the carnivorous marsupials. In order to survive, it learned to construct large nests with branches and leaves which covered and protected its underground galleries. But the adaptations which made it possible for it to thrive in the world of the marsupials were of little use when the white man arrived in Australia, and it is now in serious danger of extinction. The trees of the jungle were always a place of refuge and expansion for the marsupials. As foliage became sparser due to climate warming, they were forced to colonize the plains and grasslands. But some of the close relatives of those who live on the pastures returned to the trees they had originally come from, and this is the result. The ornate tree kangaroo is one of the 7 species of kangaroos that learn to climb. As this group of animals spread into new areas, the ornate variety was the one which reached furthest north, colonizing the lands of New Guinea. The kangaroos were the result of millions of years of adaptations in order to survive out on the open plains. Why then did they return to the trees with the enormous renewed effort to adapt that implies? There is no clear answer. Probably in order to get at the tempting foods which are out of reach, high up in the trees. When the slow evolutionary changes began, those kangaroos had no competitors for the leaves at the top of the trees. The plains were very extensive and the food sources scarce. So new types of kangaroos began to appear with different features. Stronger front legs, powerful claws, and finally the ability to move each one of its 4 legs independently, something which no kangaroo down on the ground is able to do. At the same time, the different kangaroos that had invaded the plains were in competition with each other. But as the climate became increasingly temperate and there was ever more open land, the kangaroos, which had developed a digestive system capable of assimilating the tough grasses, continued to expand. And at the same time, some trees also adapted to the increasingly temperate climate of Australia. And one in particular, the eucalyptus, was so successful that it spread throughout the continent, from north to south, creating a new type of forest. And as soon as this new habitat appeared, there was a marsupial ready to take advantage of it. The koala was able to colonize the eucalyptus forests thanks to an adaptation which would seem impossible: the ability to feed on its leaves. The leaves of the eucalyptus tree are a combination of low-quality food, indigestible material, and active poisons. Any animal that could adapt and make use of these leaves would have absolutely no competitors, and that is precisely what the koala did. Taking care of the young is especially complicated in this world of toxin-laden foods. After completing their development in the mother's pouch, breastfeeding for 6 months long, the time comes for the cubs to be weaned and start feeding on the eucalyptus leaves. At this time, the mother excretes special soft feces, a kind of pulp of half-digested leaves, which she uses to feed her young. As well as nourishing them, these feces inoculate the young with the microorganisms they will need for this difficult digestion. From then on, they will become independent from their mothers. For most part of the day, the koalas rest among the branches of the trees. This is part of their metabolic strategy. As the food is very poor, nothing better than to rest for 20 hours a day and be able to function with the least expenditure of energy. Their specially adapted digestive system takes care of the rest. 500 grams of these poisonous leaves a day are enough to keep a koala going. On the ground, the koalas are clumsy and vulnerable. Their feet, which are designed for climbing, are not made for walking on 4 legs. So they only leave the safety of the branches to move from one tree to another in search of more food or a female ready to mate. The koala is an example of the incredible versatility of adaptation of the marsupial mammals of Australia. But what happened to the monotremes, those primitive mammals which were also part of the exodus of Terra Australis, along with the marsupials, in those distant days of Gondwana? Some scientists consider them the losers. Others, perhaps more romantically, prefer to believe that they simply retired from the constant competition among mammals and chose to live just as they had for millions of years, discreetly, almost anonymously, in the most remote corners of the dense jungles, at their own pace and indifferent to the rest of the world.